to today's last session. My name is Tobias Kaiser. I'm based in Brussels as a correspondent for Die Welt, and I report from there on EU policy. And today I have the pleasure to host today's panel discussion on vocational training and labor market transition, the future model for Europe, ? Before the coffee break, Dennis Radke with his keynote already set the stage for this session. We will also take a European perspective. We'll discuss the experiences with vocational training in Germany and other countries, and we will ask whether the Teutonic model of vocational training can be a model or a blueprint for other European countries, or whether not. I'm delighted to welcome 4 experts who have dealt with vocational training from different institutional settings and different vantage points. And this variety of viewpoints will promise us a very interesting discussion. Joining us from Berlin is Nicola Brandt, head of the OECD Center Berlin. Welcome, Nicole Brandt. In Brussels, I welcome Norbert Schöbel, team leader at the European Commission. Good to have you with us. Joining us here on stage is Christian Dustmann from the University College of London. Welcome, Christian Dustmann. And last but not least, sharing the stage with us is Bernd Fitzenberger, our co-host today. Welcome and good afternoon to everyone. Each of our panelists has prepared a short keynote to introduce a different aspect of our session topic. After the 4 short keynotes, we will dive into the discussion and we will take questions from the audience here in Nuremberg as well as the audience online. I would like to remind those that join us online that you can use the chat function to ask a question during our discussion and later during the Q&A session as well. And it would be very helpful if you tell us who you're asking with your specific question. Now let's first go to Berlin, to Nicola Brandt. Thank you for being here, Ms. Brandt, and just a short introduction about you. You are head of the OECD Berlin Center, and you represent the OECD in Berlin. And in this role, and also your former roles within the OECD, you have advised governments on economic policy, on tax policy, social policy, but also, crucially, on labor market policies. Among the countries, Nicola Brandt has advised were France, Poland, Mexico, and Chile. And she and her colleagues have studied the German system of vocational training. And she will give us her view on how successful this model really is and whether it is a model other countries could or should emulate. Nicola Brandt, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss with you this issue. It's a funny coincidence, perhaps, but we just presented our Education at a Glance report today to the press this morning, and in fact, it had a focus on vocational training. And we did stress there that the dual education system that is common in countries like Germany, Austria, and Switzerland does have obvious strengths. So this strong element of workplace-based training, but also the strong engagement of social partners to shape the content of education, to work with schools, etc., does produce good results. So, for example, in Germany, the employment rates for graduates from vocational education and training is high, 88%, which is the same as for tertiary graduates, indeed. I mean, tertiary graduates, and that this includes VET, vocational education graduates, and others, do have an earnings advantage, so 62% higher than if you complete a secondary degree only. But still, it is seen OECD-wide, I know this from my work, as a successful model, and many countries are asking, can we emulate it? How can we do this? And so the question was a little bit, is it possible, or does it depend so much on traditions, etc., that you cannot really just implement it from, at least from one day to the other if you have mostly a school-based system. And well, what I can tell you from my work, for example, with countries in Eastern Europe, is that there are certainly ways to take up the strong elements. So, for example, you can see this in Eastern European countries. Many German employers, what they do is basically they ask, so where is the VET school? How can I set up my training? And sometimes together with the German and local Polish chamber, for example, they will go to school, they will set up their system, and it more or less works exactly the same way as it does at home. The question is a little bit, how do you scale this? So it's often not taken up. And I think one key element here is, of course, a tradition of strong employer involvement. In fact, what we can also see from our OECD data is that the per pupil spending in vocational education in Germany, as an example, is 40% higher than the OECD average. And this is basically money that comes from industry. So employers do invest here. And that's one of the key points that you have to get across in countries where VET is school-based. Employers have to understand that this is an investment and a profitable investment to make. It's very difficult, for example, in Anglo-Saxon countries, but in part it's perhaps, of course, because one of their strengths, very flexible labor market where young people can change the employer very often, that makes it more difficult to make this investment because it's not as profitable, if you will, if people leave after you have trained them. A second element that's perhaps more difficult, in particular in countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, etc., where the most of the firms are much smaller than what German Mittelstand, which are seen as SMEs here, but are often very big and so have a lot of capacity to organize training, etc. So that makes it really difficult. This is something what we hear in Eastern Europe or other countries, or firms are too small, they cannot handle the administrative tasks, engaging with the school, etc. And that's certainly true. But there are solutions for that. For example, Australia has invested very much in apprenticeships very successfully. And what they have done is that they have formed what is called group training associations, I think. So it's basically a body that will organize the logistics, so hiring, placement, engagement with schools, also applying for subsidies for the companies, and thus make it easier for them to participate. And another model, interesting model, is also Austria, Norway, where often smaller companies will team up and take on one apprentice in order to be able to offer all the parts of the training that they need. And we do see that some countries, for example, Portugal, are quite successful in developing a dual vocational education system. They have been successful in doing this. So I think the answer to the question that was asked a little bit is, yes, there's a long tradition behind the Teutonic models. Yes, there are some institutions that you cannot easily emulate. For example, it's important that somehow employers are also organized an employer association. One element in Germany is certainly a chamber membership, which is compulsory, and it's sometimes criticized by the OECD, but for the organization of training, it's very important because chambers of commerce do a big part of that. And also you really have to convince employers that it's an investment worth making, and then it's possible, I think, to pick up some of the good lessons of these systems that do work. And perhaps as a final word, I should say something that we also said today to the press. Of course, it is a successful model, but it has yet to make, the engagement of employers is also going down in Germany, in particular among smaller enterprises. And there's certainly a lot to do in order to make even the Germanic system more modern, digitalized, and offer new, more relevant professions in which vocational education students can get trained.
Well, thank you very much. This was very insightful and a great introduction to the topic. And if I may say so, a great transition to the next panelist, who is joining us from Brussels, Norbert Schöbel. Is he online with us?
I am, yes. Can you hear me?
Hello, good afternoon from Nuremberg. Thank you for being with us, and also I'll give you a short introduction to you and what your experience. Norbert Schöbel is the team leader at the European Commission, namely at its Directorate-General for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. Since 2014, he has been in charge of work-based learning and apprenticeships. And the portfolio he has amassed since is quite impressive. Just to mention two initiatives he was crucially involved in. He has created or co-created the European Apprentices Network, a mechanism to ensure that young people and apprentices are being heard when apprentice-related and vocational training-related policy is made. And he is also responsible for the European Alliance for Apprenticeships, which is a very broad-based alliance that tries to promote vocational training across the European Union. Now, Norbert Schöbel will today talk to us about the EU's efforts to promote vocational training across the EU, and also very importantly, about the challenges that are involved with this effort. Norbert Schöbel, thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations to the OECD. Having just published this Education at a Glance, we couldn't do better. You are really, in terms of marketing, we cannot compete with the OECD. But from the European Commission side, we do a lot. And to be honest, just to give you a few sentences about the general framework, I thought that this year, when we talk about lifelong learning more broadly, that we would more focus on upskilling and reskilling of adults. And but then COVID came, and with COVID, suddenly we realized that we have to look at young people again, because for those who remember the last crisis we had in 2013, there was a peak of youth unemployment of almost 25% on average in the EU. And now we see that there is a problem for young people again. And there's a structural problem. That means that the youth unemployment is unfortunately always much higher than the general unemployment. But unfortunately, we are now again at almost 15%. And now we have to react. And that was precisely, if I may say, and I cannot go into all the details of the documents, but on 1st of July, the European Commission adopted 4 documents. One was related to the issue of creating the bridge from school to work, communication about how to support young people. The second document was adopted, which was related to the youth guarantee. Some of you are familiar, it's an old instrument. But we wanted to make it up to date and future, let's say, oriented. Then the third document was a strategic document about the future of vocational education and training with a new vision for the next years to come. And then more broadly, another document which is called the Skills Agenda or Renewed Skills Agenda, and where you have several building blocks. One, actually, I'm also responsible, is what we call the Skills Pact, where we really try to bring all the stakeholders together to upskill and reskill our employees and invest in adults so that they either can keep their jobs or can also improve in their career. Now, the moderator just, Mr. Kaiser, mentioned that I'm responsible for the European Alliance for Apprenticeship, and this is a very interesting initiative which we launched, by the way, in Germany, in Leipzig in 2013, and it was never boring. To be honest, I thought that the topic will become less important, but now we have on 15th of July launched a renewed alliance for apprenticeship, as we call it, because again, we see, although it's not the only way of doing, but we see in apprenticeship really something which can help the transition from school to work. Actually, on the 15th of July, we launched we had a launch event. By the way, congratulations for this hybrid. It works very well, but this launch event actually, the platform collapsed for around 20 minutes. So it was one of my most difficult moments in the career. But then we had our commissioner, and not only, we had two German ministers, Mrs. Karliczek and Mr. Heil, both, I think, very nicely complementary, stressing and the importance of apprenticeships in Germany, and of course our commissioner also for the whole Europe. What we like to do under the renewed alliance is to work more closely with the social partners, also at sectoral level. We want to build on some good examples, like in Germany, there is a national alliance or national coalition, and we would like to support structures in member states where actually the governmental level and also the social partners, but also vet providers, all work together with the same goal. We have just had a meeting today. We will soon start a new initiative with regions, together with the Committee of Regions and some other umbrella organizations at European level, to work closely with the region level. And the city of Rome has started another initiative with a network on cities. So you see, we'll also try to see because how they can contribute, because the local level and the regions are both catalysts, so they can really do something in their region with the companies so that the companies invest, but also they are employers, very often very important employers. And then our moderator, Mr. Kaiser, also mentioned our network, which we created. I'm very proud, this European Apprentices Network, because we also, before, let's say, 2 years ago, we always said we need to listen to the young people, but if we don't invite them and we don't have a network, we don't know what they have to say. But that is now part of the European Alliance for Apprenticeship. Normally, I would now look at the moderator who tells me how much time I have left, but I can promise you I will also not be too long. I just wanted to mention that that we very much work very closely also with the German presidency now, of course. Next week, there is a very important informal ministerial meeting in Osnabrück on the future of vocational education and training. This will even, at least as it is now, will be organized in person, so the people will really meet. We also have a big campaign started 4 years ago. So actually we wanted to celebrate this year the 5th European Vocational Skills Week. And we work almost on a daily basis with the German presidency. And our idea was to organize it in Berlin in November. But as it looks now, we tried at least some of the key events to organize it like you do it here in a hybrid form. But it looks like, unfortunately, that we most probably will do it all online due to the latest developments on COVID. And that's really pity. I'm, as I said, here from Brussels. I would have liked to come to Nuremberg, to be honest. I like to travel, but now Brussels is a red zone, so it's very difficult for us to travel. I'm working this week. I don't have a professional background, but as you can see, the rails, it's one of my symbols that I like to travel and taking trains. But for the moment, traveling is not the important, let's say, issue. Next week, I will be again in the office, but we have only 10% of people coming to the office. Now, and I finished there. what we try to convince is member states to invest and to use the money which is available. That's my last word. You know that we are currently discussing not only the budget for the next 7 years, which is the multi-annual financial framework and the figures are quite impressive, is 1,100 billion. But also we have what we call a temporary reinforcement, as you all read in the news, partly subsidies, partly loans, which we call the Next Generation EU. And we would really like to invite member states to use the money for upskilling, reskilling, but also for apprenticeship. For instance, the German system of bonuses for SMEs is a very good model, which we would like to also invite other member states to use. We also, and I finish here, are very closely cooperating with the public employment services. They have actually done a very nice model, which is called bench learning. It's a combination of benchmarking and peer learning. And we use that also for supporting member states in the reform process on apprenticeship. So coming from the public employment services, we try to translate that into the diversity of systems. But please, and that's my last word, note that we are not responsible for apprenticeship. It's really in the competence of the member states and in several countries also of the region. I hope I was clear enough, and I really regret not being with you in Nuremberg, but I hope my contribution was valuable. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. This was very insightful, and I'm sure there will be many follow-up questions regarding all the initiatives you have just named and listed. Our next panelist doesn't need much introduction. Christian Dustmann is Professor of Economics at the University College of London and Director of CREAM, the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration. He's one of the world's most cited scholars in the fields of labor economics and migration, and after his keynote yesterday afternoon, he will share with us today how important commitment is to shape a sustainable culture of vocational training. And he will tell us why trainees in the UK get paid much more than in Germany. Christian Dustmann, the stage is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So I am shifting a little bit from people who are doing very good and very interesting applied work with getting young people into apprenticeship training like Norbert and Nicola previously. So as an economist, I am interested in questions which are probably a little bit more theoretical, but related to the apprenticeship system. And one important question living in the UK, for instance, is why is the apprenticeship system in Germany successful in the sense that it draws many young people into training positions, but the UK is struggling to develop a system which is equivalent in many respects. Now, we have worked on that and we are continuing working on that. And one very important difference is the ability of employers and companies which provide training to commit to training content, to commit to apprentices that they actually receive training. And to give you a very simple example, suppose I'm an apprentice and I am a young man and I'm interested in doing an apprenticeship training in carpentry. And very important, of course, is Nicola pointed out that employers do invest in training, but apprentices, in particular in Germany, do invest in training as well. So the wage you receive as an apprentice in Germany is far lower than you would get in an equivalent occupation if you actually entered the labor market as an unskilled worker. So you do pay for a large extent for your training. Now suppose I'm interested in becoming a carpenter, and I talked to Bernd Fitzenberger. Bernd Fitzenberger is a German employer. He runs a big carpentry. He has advertised apprenticeship training schemes, and Herr Kaiser wants an equivalent carpentry in the UK. I am having an interview with both employers. Herr Kaiser tells me, well, I'm training you, you come here for 2 years, I pay you a wage which is slightly lower than what you could get as an unskilled worker, and I will make a good carpenter of you. And I will ask him then, well, how can you commit to that? So what guarantee can you actually give me that what I learn with you has any value in the market? And Herr Kaiser tells me, well, I will make sure your final examination will look very good because I have a big influence on that. We don't have centralized examination. I will also, well, do everything to train you up as best as possible. Now, my next interview is with Bernd Fitzenberger. Bernd Fitzenberger, I'm asking him the same question, Herr Fitzenberger, how can you guarantee that my degree is of any value? And Herr Fitzenberger says, well, you see, you will have a final examination, and that final examination will be the same examination than all apprentices have in the Federal Republic, or at least in the particular state about which we are talking. And that final examination will not be just a practical examination, which is well looked at and examined and graded by independent examiners. It will also be a theoretical examination, which will be well done by state-run schools. And if you work hard, you will do good and well in those examinations. And every employer in Germany can compare your grade to the grade other apprentices get. And if you're doing well, you will be getting a good job, because employers will know that actually you have learned something. On top of it, I have personnel which is certified to educate you. We have masters. You can go to a vocational school, and you will go to a vocational school at least 1 day a week, where you can compare what you learn with me with what other apprentices learn in carpentry with other employers. Now, it is obvious that Fitzenberger's offer on providing me apprenticeship training is more attractive for me, because I know if I am working hard, I will have something which has value in the market. While if I train with Mr. Kaiser, well, I may get some examination results where the market doesn't really know what that stands for, because it is not really comparable. So the commitment ability of firms and employers to commit to training is extremely important to run successful apprenticeship schemes. Now we come to pay, and we had discussed it briefly yesterday, and that's why Herr Kaiser phrased the question in this particular way. If we look at, in particular, the United Kingdom, which for me is the country I know best, besides Germany, because I happen to live there, there is in regular intervals attempts to improve the attractiveness of apprenticeship schemes. And the way it is usually done is that the government is putting a lot of money on the table, which is substituting employers to pay apprentices. Now, suppose Herr Kaiser tells me, well, I give you a little bit more money because I just got this subsidy from the UK government. Then still, this subsidy will increase my apprenticeship wage, but it will not improve the quality of training I receive, and it will not be a guarantee that I will get a good job in the labor market. So to subsidize training schemes by subsidizing apprenticeship salaries is not a way to improve the quality of training. It's not a way to greatly improve the attractiveness of apprenticeship training unless we go basically to the possibilities that individual will have. So I go with a training firm. If that training firm pays me a similar wage than I would get as an unskilled worker. Yeah. So commitment and the possibility to commitment is of crucial importance, and that means we need to have comparable examinations comparable transparency devices and commitment to quality as we do have that in Germany. And not surprisingly, if you compare, for instance, the wages of apprentices in the UK and in Germany, in many occupations in the trades, they are far higher in the UK than they are in Germany, which is a direct result of the lack of commitment in the UK, but possibilities of employers to basically link into a system, a structure, an organization, which allows them to commit to training. And I think that's all what I would like to say about that, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit later.
Thank you very much for this. This was very insightful, and this comparison also shows us where there are possible challenges in using the German model as a blueprint for other economies and economic settings. And we'll get back to the who's more attractive as a trainer later. Joining us on stage now is, as well as Professor Bernd Fitzenberger, who's our co-host today for this event. Thank you very much for offering this opportunity to all of us. And you're here as a specialist on labor economics, where your research is really focused, and also microeconomic methods, microeconometric methods, that is. You're also a professor of econometrics at Humboldt-Universität, Berlin. And you told me you will highlight today some of the more critical aspects of the German vocational training model to show us where there's room of improvement in the model that's being hailed as a blueprint for other countries. The stage is yours.
Thank you. I would love to comment on Christian Dustmann's example and our contrast, but let me start out by saying, before I go into some critical issues which I think we should be aware of to secure the future of the German-style vocational training system, let me say that I'm a big fan of the system, and it has lots of advantages going for it, and they have been mentioned, but a critical view and a critical assessment is necessary. Some of the issues have been mentioned by Nicola Brandt already, and I would like to take a certain twist also. Let me start by what has been mentioned by Nicola Brandt already, the willingness of firms to engage in training, to provide apprenticeships under this dual system has been constantly falling over time. There is a slight erosion has been a slight erosion over the last decades. It's an investment, as it was being said, in particular if firms, as Christian Dustmann put it, commit to serious training, then they won't get sort of the productivity out of the apprentice they are paying for in this. And why are firms interested in doing this investment? Because they train a skilled worker, and of course for this worker it's important to know that the worker, the apprentice with a degree, then has lots of opportunities in the labor market. The interest in the firm is also to hire future skilled workers and to make use of that human capital, as we call it as economists, to have this skilled workforce in the future and being in a better position to keep this skilled worker because you know more about the worker than other firms who may be interested in hiring this worker. The net cost of training then pay off in the future, and they pay off if firms attract a sufficient number of good students from high school graduates to start an apprenticeship. So the success of apprenticeship training is very much related to the decisions of youth within the German education system. And what do we see there? We see a growing share of pupils, of students going for more academic degrees, for Abitur. And we see a growing share of students, of youth, going to tertiary education. So the supply of very skilled students to the apprenticeship system has been falling over time. The number of apprenticeship starts a couple of years ago fell below the number of entry cohorts in the university system. To some extent, that's what also Mr. Radke said, more education is good, and we are in times where higher education pays off, but typically this is very general education, and then at university, students in Germany decide on choosing a particular field. This effect also shows in the starting age of the apprenticeship system. Students are especially good students, are rarely willing to start an apprenticeship at the age of 15 or 16, like it used to be the case. The starting age has increased over the last couple of decades, and students are concerned, of course, to pick a specific occupation. Some scholars, whom I do not necessarily fully agree upon, emphasize that apprenticeship training is highly specific. I don't fully agree with that. A lot of the skills you acquire with an apprenticeship can also be used later in doing something else. We see a lot of occupational mobility in the labor market. But students have to be much more specific when they start an apprenticeship in their choice of training occupation. And young people find that very difficult in an era of crisis, as we see right now. Certain occupations, the number of applications for occupations has also fallen this year. The supply of apprenticeship fell by 10%, but also the students' interest, the young people interested in starting apprenticeship, also fell by an equal amount. So I would like to point to the decisions of young people who are the resource for the apprenticeship system and who are less likely now, especially those with good school outcomes, to apply for an apprenticeship. What happened in the last financial crisis, 2008, 2009? The number of apprenticeships supplied by firms fell by a fairly large amount, about 10%, like this year, for the course of 2 years, but also the number of students interested in starting apprenticeship. Exactly what we see this year. And the system did not recover. It never came up again. We stayed at this lower level, and this is a concern I have. We may see this in the current crisis. Having said that, just looking at the apprenticeship system is a too narrow view on the German system. Let me emphasize there is parallel to this firm-based vocational training, we have a system of full-time school-based vocational training, both very specific to certain occupations in the health sector, nursing, etc., education also. But also you can acquire part of the vocational training within the school-based system, and then this is being applied, sort of counted for in the traditional apprenticeship system. And another strand which is gaining importance, and unfortunately we know very little about, is the dual studies at universities. Some people here in the room have worked upon, which I think will become a more important integral part of the vocational training system in Germany. So these are some issues, and we need to, of course, learn more about these two additional pillars of the vocational training system. And we should not forget, despite all the praises, and I'm in praise of this vocational training system, there is a remaining share of young people who end up not having a vocational training degree, not having a sufficient, and for whom it is not an option to go to university, and they are basically having much worse labor market chances in the low-wage sector, which had emerged over the last 15 years or so. Let me finish at that.
This was very interesting, and I would go directly from what you said and pose a question at Norbert Schöbel in Brussels. Bernd Fitzenberger has pointed out how vocational training has become less attractive to young people in Germany. You have the more European perspective. You talk with young people in the European Apprenticeship network. How attractive is vocational training among young people in countries where it's not even established as much as in Germany? Does it really have the capacity to compete with other career paths?
That's a very good question, and thanks also for the other contributions. Just if I may react to the fact that subsidies on wages is not the model, which I would fully agree. The non-financial support is very important, particularly to raise the attractiveness. How can you raise the attractiveness? Because the question you asked me is, how do the young people think about apprenticeship? And the problem is, it's still considered in some countries, particularly the country I'm living now in Belgium, it's considered for the losers. That's why the last years we always tried to focus on excellence, because if we don't get away from the image that apprenticeship is for those who will not succeed at all at school level, then there is a problem. And that's not only in Belgium, unfortunately. At the same time, so we need to work on the attractiveness, which means, and it was highlighted also by Mr. Fitzenberger, because investing is one thing, but the quality of the apprenticeship it's not enough just to pay. By the way, a lot of apprentices are not paid. Even in Sweden, a country where they start to have a small number of apprenticeships compared to the size of the country, they're not paid for their apprenticeship. So, I mean, we are talking here about a diversity of system in Europe, which you would not even can imagine. Each country has its own, let's say, system, and the regionalization does not really help, although my heart beats for the regions. But in Belgium, for instance, you have a different system in Flanders than in Wallonia. They developed two different systems. The same in Spain. Each region develops its own apprenticeship system. Italy is a bit the same. So you can see that that does not really help if there is not a sort of coordination of bodies at national level, which then brings together the discussion about the quality of the training. That also means that we need to look at the curricula, and particularly now with COVID, we learned that we actually not only want the school part and the practical part in a company. I think we need to integrate into the curricula also a digital part to make also the apprenticeship as such more attractive. So there's a whole set of criteria, and at European level we have developed a European framework. Some people still talk about a statute. Of course, we will never in Europe develop a statute for apprenticeship because, as I already said, we don't have the competence, but we have 14 criteria of what are the learning and working conditions and what are the framework conditions to respect, so that at the end we have a quality and effective apprenticeship.
Picking up on this, I would like to turn to Berlin, to Nicola Brandt, for exactly the continuation of what you just said, Norbert Schöbel. Nicola Brandt, when and if you recommend to countries to maybe emulate the vocational training model, in a time when the popularity of the model is decreasing in countries where it's established, how do you make the case for the specific model?
Well, I think the first point is that we never recommend to emulate it, right? You can't. But what we do is, when we're looking at the country with a largely school-based system, what we're telling them, it's important to bring in employers to have a stronger workplace-based learning component, in particular to organize a system where employers will engage in defining the curricula of schools. And how do we make the case? Well, we basically say, if that is the case, if employers or social partners get together and they define spell out what they need in the future labor market, and then they influence the curriculum, and also they offer training at their workplace, and perhaps, as Christian said, not on a very high wage, but ideally with exams that guarantee some transparency, standards, etc. Then it will be attractive, because you as an apprentice know that you're going to learn something that's relevant for the labor market in the future. That's basically how we make the case for work that dual apprenticeship, and in particular employer engagement. That's very important.
Well, Christian Dustmann, Nicola Brandt just talked about skills and for future careers. The question is, with technological change, let's say in a decade or two, will vocational education still provide individuals with the sufficient skills they will need for a successful career?
That's of course a very important and timely question. Let me start by, and I will immediately come to your question. But I think a good starting point is coming back to what Bernd said. So Bernd said, okay, if you do an apprenticeship training scheme, you very early decide for a pretty narrow occupational path. That is true if the counterfactual is going to university. But if the counterfactual is entering the labor market as unskilled worker, then of course you have exactly the same moment where you have to make a decision. And in the UK we haven't even reached 50% of college attendance, and college attendance here would include many occupations which are trained by the apprenticeship training scheme in Germany. So a very large part of the workforce of every cohort enters the labor market at a very young age, making an occupational decision without getting any training. So that would be the counterfactual. The other point I would like to make, and then I come back to your question, is that, well, one reason why many people in what I call monodimensional education systems which are solely focused on academic ability and academic skills, and the UK system is one of those. Many people do not enroll and not go through that system because they simply don't have or feel they don't have the sufficient credentials to actually succeed. But they have other credentials, they have other skills, they have other abilities. Now, one of the extremely attractive aspects of the German apprenticeship training scheme is that it is multidimensional in its skill development. So if you are a very talented carpenter, you are good with spatial dimensions, you really are good, you are creative, you are good with your hands, etc. And you don't have the possibility to develop those skills in a system which is, well, strongly focused on academic skills, then these skills may be lost, not just for yourself, but also for the society in which you are living. So the development of skills which are non-academic is a very important part of the German apprenticeship training schemes, something which makes it, actually, I think, extremely attractive, not just from the standpoint of the individual, but also from the standpoint of society, which of course wants to extract the most potential in all the dimensions its citizens can actually bring into the economy. Now, coming back to your point, now what do we learn while doing an apprenticeship training scheme? There is people are often criticizing that scheme by saying, okay, well, you start as a, let me take the carpenter thing. I always like the carpenter thing because it has so many interesting dimensions. You learn to become a carpenter. So that kind of bounds you into a particular occupation. And that's not really timely because, you know, the economy is very demanding. You may be prevented to go into other professions. Well, let's take the counterfactual. Let's take the counterfactual that you don't learn to be a carpenter through an apprenticeship training scheme, but you enter the labor market as an unskilled carpenter. So why is that better? Suppose the firm in which you learn, because you are unskilled, you learn on a very particular machine. So that firm is now implementing a completely new technology. Well, you have no idea how that works because you don't have the cognitive abstract knowledge to transfer your skills as a carpenter to this new technology. However, if you have gone through a structured training scheme which combines theoretical knowledge at school with a very wide range of practical knowledge, you will be much more adaptive for the labor market of the future. And actually, that is something which is of increasing importance. What we are seeing now is that the demand of occupations changes extremely rapidly through technological change. If we want to keep people in work, that does not mean in their jobs, but in work, we need to retrain them. And we need to train them to have the ability to retrain. And I believe the German apprenticeship training scheme is a fantastic tool to actually achieve that. And I could talk about research we have done, which is actually very supportive for the hypothesis that apprentices are in a very good position to transfer their skills to the requirements of the labor market, which are coming with new technological developments.
Well, Bernd Fitzenberger, you just talked about technological change, fast-changing job profiles. Should there be more emphasis in the future or already now on more general human capital and transferable skills? Or should we stick to the model that we have right now where it's often quite specific skills that are being taught?
I think, I can only support what Christian just said. In fact, this view that the apprenticeship system is extremely specific misses part of the general aspects. By successfully doing an apprenticeship, you acquire a number of skills in a very different setting than in a purely school-based. And this is for a lot of people a better system than to be also flexible in the labor market because you acquire some general skills. So this traditional distinction a lot of the economic discussion of skill formation focuses upon misses this point. I fully agree, if you enter the labor market without vocational training, you typically end up with much more specific skills within the firm. Having said that, of course, an apprenticeship system which writes in stone what you need to learn, what will be asked in the exams 3 years, 4 years later at the Chamber of Commerce, may be somewhat sluggish in adapting to new needs. So a crucial part of this is, of course, that firms have the current state of technology, and apprentices should check for that, sort of in the spirit, what Christian said. When you apply for your carpenter apprenticeship, you should check out the firm, and maybe Mr. Kaiser, after all, has the most recent technology. And then the apprentice may want to go to your place and acquiring the skill using this new technology. And also the curricula have to be adjusted. There is evidence that evidence from IAB showing that when curricula have been changed and sort of the content of the theoretical content of the training has been adjusted, those who just received the training after the reform are doing a bit better in the labor market. So the system will also only survive if it adapts to changing skill needs and if it adapts to what is being used in practice, and it should keep in mind the need for for a combination of general and specific skills, and the general skills will, of course, then also help graduates from the apprenticeship system to succeed in the future. However, in times of digitalization, in times of strong technological change, very high-tech fields in tertiary education are doing really well, and they attract also students away from the apprenticeship system. One should not forget, for very talented students, they could traditionally think of getting a technical degree in the apprenticeship system and then continue as self-employed as a master. I mean, doing a master as a master craftsman, master craftswoman as a second step and become a successful entrepreneur. They could also go to university, acquire a technical degree, and maybe get the more recent, the more advanced technological trends. And this is where some of the technology-oriented fields of the apprenticeship system are struggling with. And maybe this dual studying at university is an important part, an important development where this is maybe combined in a good way in the future to keep practically oriented students in close contact with firms.
Interesting. So, do you see a stronger role for this kind of education in the future?
Yes, I think we will see a more diversified portfolio of vocational training routes. We should also not forget that those occupations where you get your training through the school-based system, nursing, healthcare, education, are gaining importance. And there are two strong biases. There is a strong gender bias. When we talk about the traditional apprenticeship system, it's a predominantly male system, and more the share of females, of girls going to the vocational training is more into the school-based training system. And we also have the issue in Germany that among youth with migration background, the willingness to start an apprenticeship, or also the willingness of firms to hire youth with a migration background is both lower. There are concerns that they lose out in this system. Mm-hmm. That's a different topic.
That's a different topic indeed, yeah. But it's an interesting topic nonetheless. We talked a lot about the commitment of companies as far as apprenticeships or dual education is concerned. Nicola, Brandt, you've told me when we talked beforehand that you're trying to tell companies in other countries to look at the models that are out there and that there could be long-term that investment into apprentices and education could be a very profitable long-term investment for companies. In how far is trust an issue and commitment on behalf of the apprentices? Because companies have to be, if they invest into a person, they have, of course, to be sure that this person stays with the company. Are there mechanisms to, in countries where this kind of investment is not really common, or can you imagine mechanisms to ensure that there is a certain kind of commitment or a certain kind of trust?
Well, the best mechanism, of course, to ensure that the apprentice stays on is that if you offer them attractive job opportunities afterwards. And then, of course, you cannot have 100% commitment. And the way to handle that is ideally you create a system where many firms participate so that they know when they choose an apprentice, maybe they will get somebody from elsewhere. But yeah, I think it's a lot of, at least, well, it's a bit anecdotal evidence we heard in Poland, for example, in Eastern Europe, when we worked with those countries. But before, so for very long, it was very difficult to convince them to invest in this kind of training. And often they do ask the question, so, but what are these subsidies that we're getting to do this? Because it's cumbersome, it's costly, etc. But at least in the last few years, the labor shortage in Poland and other Eastern European countries, and many OECD countries, was so severe that suddenly there was heightened interest in how to do this. And I know that the lady who set up some vocational education programs with German firms in Poland at the Polish-German Chamber of Commerce, where she couldn't, she had requests from all over the country. How can we do this, and what needs to be done? So I think it's when you do need skilled labor that you realize that this could be a good model, and then the best thing to keep on an apprentice is to offer them something, career prospects, a good salary when they finish, and that may also create the commitment by the student to invest in their training and not earn the same kind of money they can earn as an unskilled worker, as Christian said.
Thank you very much. I would open the floor now to questions from the audience here in Nuremberg and also from online. If there are any, there are already two questions we got from our online attendants. Jonathan Lettner from the University of Bamberg asks, I think many of us are familiar with the advantages of vocational education. However, one of the disadvantages is that it can reinforce existing inequalities, especially with regard to class or migrant background. This is especially true in Germany, which is otherwise a country that is a model for apprenticeship. Can you talk about policies that could address these inequalities? This is a question for Norbert Schöbel and Nicola Brandt as well. Let's maybe first move to Brussels, and Norbert Schöbel, what are your thoughts on Jonathan Lettner's question?
It's an important one, and I tried already a little bit to explain. I think in general, VET has, compared, if I say VET, vocational education training, particularly apprenticeship, has big advantages in being very inclusive. By the way, we talked about financial support, and we think that for those companies who invest and for disadvantaged groups, for instance, that they could also get some support for this, although many companies do it, particularly where they have this tradition, part of their corporate social responsibility. They simply sell it. I know a very good example in Berlin where they have 100 employees, an SME, 20 apprenticeships, and also combining, integrating into the 20 apprenticeships somebody who is from a disadvantaged group. They very much they are in a male-dominant sector, integrate women. They do breaks and do some physical exercise, and of course the young people like it. And so there are a lot of good examples. Also, the gender issue is very important. I know again in Berlin, and you can confirm, maybe you from the OECD, Girls Attack, there are some initiatives where the young girls go to the fairs of the companies, they represent the companies, and then when the father passes by, then the father would say, but this is not for you girls. No, the girls say, no, it's a profession which also is maybe male dominant, but you can learn. You know, the new technologies allow a lot for young women now to do the jobs which men have done. So being short, I'm a big fan of career guidance, and for me, I would link it to that topic, because you need, at the end, every individual person needs to find its or place in the society. And particularly if you talk about apprenticeship, it should not be dead end. That's not the case anymore in Germany. In some countries, unfortunately, it is still considered to be a dead end. So you have very difficulties then if later on to continue maybe in higher education. And And that's why I think career guidance from the very beginning is important, so that everybody, whatever background you have, migrant background, and Germany was quite successful to integrate migrants. I have seen figures which are really impressive in a short in a short time period. And there are a lot of issues. I'm sorry if I cannot answer maybe fully the question, but for me, we need to do more on guidance for these young people. They have more and more difficulties to find their place, and particularly if they're very young, they are influenced by maybe the wrong people, either the teacher or the parents. And although parents usually love their children, they are not the best person maybe to guide them what is the best for their young people.
Thank you very much, Nicola, Brandt. What are your thoughts on the question and the question whether vocational training actually increases differences?
Well, I mean, one joke we make about vocational training, including in Germany often, is that you always recommend it to other people's children, but never to your own. And part of the story is that at least if you stop at the secondary level, it is true that you will earn less, or your earnings prospects are lower than when you go on to tertiary education. But as Bernd has said, there's now these possibilities to have VET, bachelor programs, but also some, going on, getting a Meister brief brings you to a tertiary education level. So my answer to the question would be that it's really important that there are opportunities to carry on to study more, continuous training, in particular tertiary training, which is in principle true in Germany. I think 92% of VET students can basically access tertiary education. We're not quite sure how many of them actually do that. So it's important also to make sure that the offer is being taken up, and that can make it more inclusive. I'm hoping that this is what the question was, that it can increase disparities because people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to do vocational education and then perhaps stay there. But the important thing are the bridges and opportunities to study further during your career.
Well, thank you very much. We have one more question from our online attendees, from Clément Brébion from the Copenhagen Business School, CBS. Good day to Copenhagen. He asks specifically for Christian Dustmann. In the paper I presented yesterday, I find that subsidies to apprenticeship training in France increase turnover strategies in firms that are actually taking on apprentices without bringing new firms to train.
Well, yeah, I think of course, that's the question many politicians ask themselves, and I thought I addressed that at least partly in the beginning. So if I was to develop an apprenticeship scheme, I would make sure that I implement a system which allows firms to commit to training. So that would be, for instance, by introducing centralized monitored examinations, by having curricula that are standardized, by having training personnel that has actually training abilities, that is trained to train, and by adding a cognitive element through vocational schools. And that basically is more or less what the apprenticeship training schemes in the German-speaking countries in Europe provide. If I had to do that, if somebody would ask me, and nobody of course asked me, but if somebody asked me in the UK, well, how should we try that? I would try that in the trades. We have, that's where those systems are coming from, and I think that's where such pilot would be actually something very interesting to undertake. So one could take a bunch of occupations like plumbing, electrician, carpentry, etc., and implement a centralized scheme by first working, of course, with a small number of companies and then build it up. And actually, the scheme the UK had, well, several decades ago, was not so very different. It was then abolished in many steps because centralization of training was considered to be too restrictive. So that I think would be my answer to that question. That's how I would go about to try implementing such a scheme. And of course, subsidies will be there. These schemes are subsidized. The German scheme is definitely subsidized. It is subsidized through vocational schooling. Vocational schooling, which itself has actually a very interesting side effect. If I train somebody in cognitive skills, then if human capital of cognitive nature is complementary to other skills I acquire on the job, those people will learn faster than if they would not go to vocational schools. So there is a certain aspect of attractiveness also from the viewpoint of the employer to train individuals via a vocational training scheme because they acquire complementary skills which make my efforts actually more productive. Somebody who knows how to well, distinguish the physical qualities of wood will be easier to be trained how to treat and how to work with different types of wood, for instance. And one could extend that, of course, in all types of directions.
That's very interesting how these two types of tool education reinforce each other. That's interesting.
Yes, these are things which we are working on at the moment, actually. So hopefully in 2-3 years I can show you some results on that.
I think Nicola Brandt wants to add something to what you just said.
Just very briefly, because I did study the French system for a very long time. And I think where the answer is very right is that, in fact, in France, they do have a dual system, which is smaller than the school-based system. But somehow they really struggle with expanding, scaling the apprenticeship system, if you will. But my view has always been that they do focus much too much on giving subsidies in very complicated ways, by the way, and not enough on thinking about how to bring companies into the school-based system. And that's perhaps where this observation or this result of the study comes from.
Very interesting. Thank you. Before we move on to the next online question, are there any questions here in the hall? There's two. Yeah, Mr. Stepanok.
Thank you. What do the panelists think of the idea of potentially to make vocational training more attractive, breaking some tracks into modules or pieces? Like, for instance, within IT, there are courses where one gets a certificate for working with a specific program. I mean, obviously, for some programs, it's not possible. I mean, if a medical doctor would be vocationally trained, I mean, one cannot become half a medical doctor, but maybe within carpentry you can do it in models, because if you have a quickly changing environment with innovation, then 2 years is a risk, it's a lock-in. So maybe you do half a year, you get a certificate for one part of it, and then you do half a year later. Would that be a possibility to make things livelier and to have more demand from the side of high school students, for instance, to participate? And let's be more concrete within the context of Germany, the German system.
Fitzenberger?
I like the idea, and I've been involved in discussions whether this should be promoted. There is evidence, however, that this is not going to work, and exactly for the reasons I think Christian Dustmann so clearly emphasized. With the apprenticeship degree, you have a very strong signal in a labor market which relies a lot on certification, and which is very clear. To, to make such a short training, modular training. There's a long discussion about modular training, and also we discussed that with colleagues from Switzerland. I think in Switzerland this plays a bigger role, the modularization. It seems that low-skilled workers, students, don't find these attractive exactly for the reason I have to pay for this training by a lower wage, or even have to pay for the training course. Firms may not want to subsidize or pay for that training. There is no structure where the government directly subsidizes that. I get this piece of paper. Who tells me that in 5 years this is worth anything? In a labor market like ours, where certificates play a key role, but if there is an inflation of certificates, we've had a similar discussion with the inflation of bachelor degrees in the tertiary education system, it seems that the interest to do that is very low. The specific example I've seen this was in the context of temporary help agencies, where this was offered to temporary agency workers to improve their skill base, and there was very little interest. And so in the policy consulting context where this was being discussed, it turned out not to be successful.
Thank you very much. Christian Dustmann, do you have anything to add here?
I have nothing to add.
And
however, if the counterfactual, if you get the low-skilled person or somebody who has no degree to engage in some training, and it's possible, and this is of interest to employers, this may help. But it rarely happens. So it's an issue. It's not an easy solution.
The problem of an overly certified labor market is, and that actually is directly related to the first question we saw on disadvantage, is that acquisition of certificates means that you have to make investments which need a long payoff period. So, to give you an example, if we have a Syrian refugee who is offered an apprenticeship as a baker, then this means a 3 years investment at reduced wages with an uncertain probability that the payoff period will be very long, because it could be that there is, a situation in Syria changes and the residence permit is not prolonged. Now, being a certified baker in Germany is not providing that individual with more opportunities in Damascus. Nobody really cares about whether that particular baker has an apprenticeship training in Germany or not. So, in particular, if it comes to people who have perhaps not very long-term perspectives or likelihoods or probabilities that their payoff period is not extremely long, certifications lead to strong disincentives. That, for instance, in my view, is one of the big reasons why the UK labour market is very attractive for immigrants. Certification is not required in many jobs, and certification which is costly here need not to be acquired by the individual. So not everything which has to do with certification is good. If we think about immigration, for instance, then an overly certified labor market is actually slightly problematic, and we have to think about getting out of that dilemma, because investments take time to pay off. If I don't have that perspective, or if there is a high uncertainty about whether that payoff period will actually realize, then I may not want to make that particular investment.
That's an interesting aspect. I saw there was another question. Malte Sandner had a question.
Actually, two questions. One is for Christian. You said that in the UK the apprenticeship system was abolished because it was perceived as too restrictive. And actually I can imagine that for the firms an apprenticeship system has burdens. It takes them flexibility. They have to, what you said often, they have to give commitments, they have to maybe part of a chamber, and I guess there are costs. And actually what I want to ask is, are there estimations about costs for the firms to give this commitment? And the second question is, what do the panelists think about exemptions of minimum wage regulations for apprenticeship for trainees?
So maybe I can just briefly start on... Sorry?
The first question was for you. So.
Okay, so let me just... sorry, no, the first was again about what?
It was about the costs of...
oh, yes, sure, yeah, okay, so yeah, that's exactly... So the BIBB has actually some excellent work assessing the cost of training from the perspective of the firm. So there are repeated undertakings where they survey employers and try to find out how expensive apprenticeship training is from the perspective of the employer, and I think that is very valuable reading. On the second question, well, to introduce a binding minimum wage for young people, I think, is absolutely disastrous. It actually kills apprenticeship type systems in its roots, because it takes away the possibility from young people to pay for their training by accepting a lower wage. So I think that is not a good idea at all, and anything I know from evidence in other European countries that is always at least correlated with non-employment of the respective age group. So I think minimum wage is one can think about it however one wants, and in many cases it is a very good thing. But I think it can be very damaging for very young people who enter the labor market and who would like to train. It also creates a strong disincentive to acquire further education for which you pay partly by yourself.
Thank you very much. A brief look to Berlin and to Brussels. Nicola, Brandt, Norbert, Schöbel, do you have anything to add to the second question, or?
If I may start, I listened very carefully to the discussions, and I found it interesting what you just said on the minimum wage. And I agree, and I said already before that in many countries they are not paid at all. And in our quality framework, we talk about pay and or compensation. But at least the minimum wage is a good indicator. And I think in each country, whatever the level then is it 60% or 80%? But it's a good reference to find a compromise on what it depends also in each year how much of pay is done to the apprentice. But I agree that the minimum wage as such is more like a disincentive than rather helping. But it's a good indicator, I would say. If I may ask, and you mentioned the BIP figures, if you have figures, we are really looking desperately on figures. Although CEDEFOP has published some figures, but we really look at the costs. We know that from Germany and Switzerland we have the evidence, but I would also like to invite all the audience. We need more evidence on what apprenticeship means, and in terms of figures, what are the costs in the different sectors, particularly when it comes to other countries than Germany and Switzerland. And then maybe a last word, because there was a previous question from Copenhagen. And it was interesting because Denmark is actually one of the rare examples where I would say that the employers fund they have introduced in Denmark is actually, compared to what the UK has done, quite successful. So there are some models in Europe which are, it's not like a levy, but it's a very good model that people invest also in apprenticeship, and if they not invest, they pay to the fund, and the fund is used for that. So there are some good models, and Denmark, I think, is a good model in that respect.
As it happens, we have another question from Copenhagen. If wonderful.
Can I add something on the minimum wage?
Yes, absolutely.
Sorry. I fully agree with Christian Dustmann with regard, or with what has been said, with regard to the national statutory minimum wage. The exemption for apprenticeship is important to make this construction work. But there is a small qualification. We have a lot of issues with convincing students to start an apprenticeship. And there is some evidence that students take the pay as an apprentice as a signal, and they know that they will live for 2 to 3 years, 3.5 years on this pay. And I think the recent increases, which are way below the statutory minimum wage, the recent increases may have helped. I mean, without COVID, they may have helped to increase the willingness to start an apprenticeship. When a young adult, when an adolescent compares starting an apprenticeship, being a bit myopic with starting as an unskilled worker in the labor market, where he or she could make more money, of course, in the short run.
Well, but that's a political question, right?
Right.
So if I make the political decision that I subsidize apprentices above their productivity for the firm, then the question is who pays for that. I think it would be dangerous to have firms paying for that, because that may actually reduce the willingness to train, because their calculations do not square up anymore.
Sure.
And if the taxpayer is willing to pay for that, then this is a completely, of course, different thing. So it's I think a political decision. Yeah.
Interesting question, and it's a difficult decision, indeed. We have one more question from Copenhagen for Bernd Fitzenberger, again from Clément Brébion, who wants to know, this regards COVID and what you mentioned, that there are less positions for apprentices and also less interest from young people in apprenticeships. And he wants to know whether Bernd Fitzenberger thinks that this drop in demand whether you think this is mostly students with good results at school that think that in times of crisis apprenticeship training should be avoided, and whether this might actually benefit those school achievers, or students with low achievements at school.
I don't think so at all. If we see a drop in the number of apprenticeships offered, if we see also students applying less for apprenticeship, the better students will go on, maybe acquire more general education, eventually going to tertiary education. They will do well in the labor market. They may just be lost for the firms who in the future don't have access to work with a medium skill, with a medium degree. The low achievers in the school system in a bad economic situation find it harder to enter the labor market through an apprenticeship. And this is not going to improve through a crisis. They may be more equal because more students with lower educational outcomes don't end up with an apprenticeship degree. So as part of the question, maybe the competition will be less because there's less opportunities, but they will be worse off in the longer run, because then later on they will compete in the labor market with people who in better economic times have had the chance to acquire an apprenticeship degree. and that they will move ahead.
Thank you very much.
That's my view, prediction. We can talk in 10 years about that.
We'll see exactly. We'll come back 10 years from now. There's, of course, a lot more to say on this subject, and we've only been able to scratch the surface on this panel. But hopefully it was insightful, and many thanks to the panelists, both present here on stage and the panelists in Berlin and Brussels. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us, and thank you, the online audience and the presence audience, for your insightful questions.